A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
There is something undeniably romantic about the idea of a flying boat. I am not talking about a tiny Cessna with floats strapped to the bottom, though those are cool in their own way. I am talking about the massive lumbering giants of the 1930s, like the Pan Am Clipper. You would pull up to a dock in San Francisco, walk across a mahogany gangplank, and fly across the Pacific in what was essentially a floating hotel. It feels like a piece of the future that we somehow lost to the sterile, grey-carpeted, concrete world of modern airports. Today's prompt from Daniel is about whether we can bring that back. He is asking about the engineering feasibility of large-scale seaplane operations, the noise abatement potential, and the wild idea of whether you could put an Airbus A330 on giant retractable floats.
It is a fascinating thought experiment, Corn. I am Herman Poppleberry, by the way. I have spent the last few days looking into the actual hydrodynamics of this, and the gap between the romantic vision and the physics is, well, it is wide. The 1930s were the golden age for a very specific reason. We did not have long, paved runways yet. If you wanted to fly a massive plane with 4 engines, you needed a runway 3 miles long, and the ocean was the only place that provided that for free. Once the Second World War happened and we built massive concrete strips all over the globe, the efficiency of land-based planes just crushed the flying boat. But Daniel's question isn't just about nostalgia, it is about urban planning.
It feels like a failure of imagination, right? Or maybe just a path dependency. We built all these massive concrete strips during the Second World War, and the aviation industry just followed the concrete. But when you look at the congestion in modern hubs, the idea of a seaport starts to look very attractive again, especially for noise abatement. If you can land 3 miles offshore, you are not rattling the windows of 1 million people on your final approach. We talked about this a bit in episode 1329 when we looked at high-stakes hubs versus remote operations. The choreography of a land-based airport is so rigid, but the water offers a kind of flexibility that we have largely abandoned.
That is the primary driver for a lot of the renewed interest. If you look at the Vancouver Harbor Flight Center, which is probably the best modern example of a high-frequency seaport, you see a model that actually works. They handle over 50,000 movements a year. It is a high-frequency, highly efficient logistics node right in the heart of the city. You walk off the plane and you are 3 blocks from the financial district. But, and this is the big but Daniel pointed out, it is limited to small, light aircraft. Scaling that to a wide body like an Airbus A330 is where the physics starts to fight back.
Let's define what we mean by a seaport first. Because it is not just a dock with some fuel barrels, right? To handle real traffic, you need a complex logistics node. You need wave attenuation, customs and immigration facilities, high-speed refueling, and a way to move hundreds of passengers from a floating platform to the shore without it taking 3 hours. Is the seaport a relic of the 1930s, or is it a missed opportunity for the 2030s?
To answer that, we have to look at the transition from the flying boat to the land-based jet. In the 1930s, the biggest planes in the sky were seaplanes. The Pan Am Boeing 314 Clipper was a beast for its time. It carried 74 passengers in 1939, which was massive. It had dressing rooms, a dining salon, and even bridal suites. Why did that work then, and why does it seem so impossible now?
I love the history of the Clipper. It was the height of romantic travel. But why did it work? Was it just because we didn't have the runways?
In the late 30s, there were very few paved runways long enough to handle a heavy, land-based long-range aircraft. The ocean was the only runway that was already long enough. If you wanted to fly from San Francisco to Honolulu, you needed a lot of fuel, which meant a heavy plane, which meant a long takeoff run. The water provided that for free, but the Clipper was slow. It had a massive, drag-heavy hull because the bottom of the airplane had to be a boat. As soon as we developed high-strength landing gear and the military paved the world with concrete during the war, the aerodynamic penalty of a boat hull became a deal breaker.
So it is a drag issue. But what about the impact? Daniel asked about the chop of the sea. When you are landing at 150 knots, a 2-foot wave is not just a bump, it is a structural event.
This is where we get into hydro-elasticity. This is the core of the problem. Water is roughly 800 times denser than air. When a hull hits the water at high speed, the water does not have time to move out of the way. It behaves more like a solid. For a small float plane, you can over-engineer the struts to handle that. But for an aircraft the size of an A330, the sheer force of hitting a wave at landing speed would require a structural weight that would leave almost no room for fuel or passengers. The kinetic energy you have to dissipate is astronomical.
I have seen some research into active wave dampening for seaports. If the goal is reliability, you cannot just hope for a calm day. If a major airline is going to run a hub out of a harbor, they need to know they can land in a 6-foot swell. Could we actually stabilize a patch of the ocean, enough to make it a reliable hub?
There are some wild engineering concepts for this. One is the pneumatic breakwater. You run pipes along the seabed and blow bubbles upward. Those bubbles break the surface tension and disrupt the orbital motion of the waves, effectively flattening the chop in a specific corridor. It sounds like science fiction, but it has been tested. Another is mechanical, using massive floating barriers that act as wave attenuators. The problem is the scale. To create a landing strip for a widebody, you would need a calm zone several miles long. The energy required to keep that water still during a storm would be astronomical. You are essentially trying to build a giant, floating swimming pool in the middle of the ocean.
It seems like we are trying to force the water to act like concrete. Maybe the mistake is thinking we need to land the whole plane on the water. Daniel asked about fitting an A330 with retractable giant floats. I am picturing an A330 with these massive pontoons that fold up into the fuselage. Is that even remotely feasible from a center of gravity perspective?
It had a wingspan of over 320 feet, and it was made of birchwood because of wartime metal shortages. Howard Hughes proved you could build something that big and get it to fly, but it was never commercially viable. It was too heavy, too slow, and too vulnerable to the environment. Even modern attempts, like the Japanese Shinmeiwa US-2, which is a brilliant piece of engineering, struggle with scale. The US-2 can land in sea state 3, which means waves up to 3 meters, but it is a specialized search and rescue aircraft. It costs over $100 million and carries a handful of people.
That is the square hublot rearing its ugly head again. We talk about this a lot on the show. As you double the size of an object, the weight triples because volume grows faster than surface area. It is interesting that the Japanese are the ones leading the way there. It makes sense given their geography and the need for island-hopping rescue missions. But even they haven't tried to make a wide-body version.
And you have the gear-up landing risk. If a float fails to deploy or collapses on impact, you are not just sliding down a runway with some sparks, you are cartwheeling into the ocean. It is a constant battle. Every time a seaplane lands in salt water, you have to do a freshwater wash of the engines. If you were running a high-frequency hub like we discussed in the airport lighting episode, episode 438, the turnaround times would be destroyed by the maintenance requirements.
We have to talk about the Spruce Goose, right? The Hughes H-4 Hercules. That was the ultimate too-big-to-fly cautionary tale. Howard Hughes built this massive wooden flying boat during the war because of metal shortages. It only flew once for about a mile and only a few feet off the water. Was that a failure of the concept or just bad timing?
It was a bit of both. The Spruce Goose proved that you could build something that large, but it also proved that the power-to-weight ratio required to get that much mass out of the water suction was nearly impossible with piston engines. Water has a sticky quality surface tension and suction that holds on to a hull. You need a massive amount of thrust just to break free of the water and get on the step, which is when the hull starts planing on top of the water rather than sitting in it. For a wide body, the fuel burn just to take off would be ruinous.
So the dream of the wide-body seaplane is probably dead on arrival. But what about the middle ground? I was reading about hydrofoil-assisted takeoff, or HATO. The idea is that you use small foils to lift the hull out of the water earlier in the takeoff run to reduce that massive drag.
Hydroskis and hydrofoils are the only way this works at scale. If you can get the main hull out of the water at, say, 60 knots, you avoid the worst of the drag and the impact stress. The Navy experimented with this in the 1950s with the Convair XF2Y1 Sea Dart. It was a supersonic jet seaplane that used retractable hydroskis. It worked, but it was incredibly violent for the pilot. The vibration as those skis hit the water at high speed was enough to cause physical injury. It was like riding a jackhammer across a cobblestone street at 200 miles per hour.
That does not sound like a premium passenger experience. I can imagine the pre-flight announcement. Please fasten your seatbelts. We are about to experience some light bone-shaking vibration as we transition to the foils. But if we solve the vibration, does it solve the noise problem? Because that is the big selling point. If we can move the noise away from people, we can fly more often.
This is where the environmental trade-off comes in. You solve the noise problem for humans, but you create a new one for the marine ecosystem. Propeller cavitation, the formation of tiny bubbles that collapse with incredible force, creates a massive amount of underwater noise. It disrupts whale migrations and messes with fish populations. And then there is the pollution. Every time a plane lands or takes off, there is a risk of fuel or hydraulic fluid entering the water. In a closed harbor, that builds up fast.
And don't forget the salt. Corrosion is the silent killer of seaplanes. You are basically dunking a high-performance machine into a vat of acid every day. We talked about this in episode 676 when we looked at the comeback of the airship. Airships don't have to touch the water, which gives them a huge maintenance advantage.
The maintenance cycles for the old clippers were grueling. They had to be hauled out and washed down with fresh water constantly. For a modern airline running 20-minute turnarounds, that is a non-starter. You would need entirely new material science, perhaps carbon fiber composites that are completely immune to salt, before the economics make sense. Even then, you have the issue of barnacles and biofouling if the plane sits in the water for more than a few hours.
It is funny because we have all this tech for stealth jets and high-altitude drones, which we talked about back in episode 1004. But the basic challenge of water impact is still something we have not fully solved for large aircraft. It feels like we are waiting for a breakthrough in materials that might never come because the concrete runway is just too convenient. But what about the Akronoplan? The Soviet Caspian Sea Monster. It is not quite a seaplane, but it uses the ground effect to fly just a few feet above the water.
The Akronoplan is a fascinating middle ground. By staying in the ground effect, the cushion of air between the wing and the surface, you get incredible lift with very little drag. You can carry massive loads, like an A330, without needing a giant runway. But they are notoriously difficult to maneuver. If you hit a large wave at 300 knots while you are only 10 feet off the surface, it is game over. They are great for calm inland seas like the Caspian, but for the open ocean, they are terrifying.
So if the plane can't be a boat, and the boat can't be a plane, where does that leave us? Let's talk about the practical takeaways. If you are an engineer or an investor looking at the future of water-based transport, where is the real opportunity?
It is like driving a car with square wheels over a cobblestone street. This is why the industry is pivoting to eVTOL, electric vertical takeoff and landing. If you can take off vertically from a floating dock, you bypass the whole hydro-elasticity problem. You do not need to slice through the water at 100 knots if you can just lift off it.
If the cost of land becomes infinite, does the cost of a seaplane suddenly look reasonable?
That is the only scenario where it works. If government regulation or land scarcity makes traditional airports impossible, then the inefficiency of the seaplane becomes the cost of doing business. But even then, I think we would see offshore floating airports before we saw wide-body seaplanes. It is much easier to build a giant floating concrete deck for traditional planes than it is to build a plane that can survive the ocean. Look at Kansai International Airport in Japan. They built an entire artificial island in Osaka Bay. It was incredibly expensive and it is slowly sinking, but it allows them to run a standard, high-efficiency hub without bothering anyone with noise.
And for the big stuff? If we still need to move 300 people at a time across the ocean, are we stuck with land-based airports?
Not necessarily. I think the ultimate solution is the floating runway. Instead of trying to make the plane land on the water, we bring the land to the water. We already have the technology for very large floating structures. Look at offshore oil rigs or some of the proposed floating cities. If you build a 3-mile-long floating deck that is moored to the seabed, you get all the benefits of a seaport, but you can use standard A330s with their existing landing gear.
That sounds like an unsinkable aircraft carrier for civilians. We actually did a deep dive on Diego Garcia in episode 1413, which is basically a natural version of that. But building a man-made one in deep water near a major city is a massive civil engineering project. Is it cheaper than building a new airport on land?
In many cases, yes. If you look at the cost of land acquisition in a place like London or New York, plus the decades of legal battles over noise and environmental impact, a floating runway 5 miles offshore starts to look like a bargain. You build it in sections in a shipyard, tow it out, and anchor it. It is a known quantity. You don't have to worry about hydro-elasticity because the plane is landing on a dry, stable surface.
It is a shift in perspective. We move away from the idea of the plane being a boat and toward the idea of the airport being a ship. It solves the noise problem, it solves the land use problem, and it keeps the physics of the aircraft simple.
And it allows us to keep the efficiency of the modern jet engine. We don't have to carry the weight of floats or a hull across the Atlantic. We just need a better place to put the wheels down. The sea is a dynamic runway, and we have spent a century trying to ignore it or pave over it. But if we want to solve the congestion in our cities, we have to learn to work with it.
I wonder if the romanticism of the seaplane actually holds it back. We think of it as this vintage, adventurous thing, which makes it hard for people to see it as a serious part of a 21st century transport grid. We see the Clipper, and we think of Indiana Jones, not a commute to work.
There is a bit of that. But when you look at the data on urban density and the sheer amount of time people spend traveling to airports that are 50 miles outside the city center, the efficiency of a downtown seaport, even for small craft, is undeniable. If you can save 2 hours of ground transport by landing in the harbor, people will pay a premium for that. The weird prompt here is really, why are we still using 19th century land use patterns for 21st century flight?
It is a classic example of how a technical challenge, like landing on the chop, is tied to a social challenge, like urban noise. We often focus so much on the physics that we forget the policy drivers that make certain technologies viable. If the political pressure to reduce noise becomes high enough, the engineering impossibilities of the seaport will suddenly become urgent priorities.
I think we will see the hydroski technology seeing a bit of a renaissance in the private sector first. High-speed ferries and luxury craft are already using it to improve ride quality. Once that tech is matured and the vibration issues are solved, the leap to small passenger aircraft is much smaller.
So, to wrap up Daniel's question, can we seaplane an A330? Probably not without making it a terrible airplane, but can we build a seaport that handles the equivalent of an A330's traffic? Absolutely, but it will probably look more like a floating island than a dock.
The future of water-based aviation is probably not a plane that is also a boat, but a standard plane landing on a very high-tech barge. And for the regional stuff, the EVTOLs will take over the harbors. The era of the flying boat might be over, but the era of the floating hub is just beginning.
That is a great place to leave it. The sea is a dynamic runway, and we need to stop treating it like a static one. If we can't land the plane on the water, we might just have to bring the runway to the water. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the show on an even keel.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the research and generation of this show.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach new listeners who are looking for deep dives like this.
We will be back next time with another prompt. Goodbye.
Take it easy.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show.